before the humming of electric lights, before clocks ticked in every room, and long before the 8-hour workday cemented itself into the modern psyche, the night was a different kind of creature. Alive, stretching long and uncertain across the world's early centuries. It breathed not in minutes and deadlines, but in rhythms that danced with firelight and faded stars. In that forgotten darkness, human beings slept differently. Not once but twice. In the medieval countryside, the village settled into stillness as the sun dipped below the treetops. There was no instant blackness, just the long dusk when animals settled and families withdrew to hearth and straw beds. People would lie down not for a continuous slumber, but for what they called their first sleep. It came early, sometimes just after evening prayers or supper, lasting a few hours. Deep and dream-heavy, it was the kind of rest that brought the body low and loosened the mind. Then somewhere in the middle of the night, sometime around midnight or the second cock's crow, they would wake. Not by accident, not in panic, not in dread of insomnia, but by design. The house stirred in soft murmurings. In this strange interval, called the watch or the waking, people sat by the fire, smoked pipes, read scriptures, even visited neighbors. Some prayed, believing this hour to be blessed, a space between time itself. Others reflected, journaled, or tended to small chores. Couples often made love in this quiet window between sleep and sleep, believing it the most fertile hour. Children might murmur in their beds while parents whispered nearby. It was not seen as restlessness, it was simply normal. After this interlude, ranging from an hour to 2 or more, people would return to bed for their second sleep, which carried them into the early dawn. This latter sleep was lighter, dreamier, less anchored to the bones. And when morning came, there was no sense of something broken or incomplete. This was simply how it had always been. Clues to this pattern remain scattered in ancient literature, like footprints in wet ash. In Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, in Virgil's writings, and even in court records and peasant diaries, references abound to first sleep and second sleep, as though the notion were as natural as bread and water. In the 16th century, a French physician wrote prescriptions for patients to enjoy their rest between sleeps. In diaries and letters, families described this 2-part rhythm casually, without remark, the way one might refer to breakfast and lunch. But what changed? The transformation began slowly with the spread of artificial light. In the wealthiest cities of Europe, candles and oil lamps lengthened evenings, nudging bedtime ever later. The night was no longer something to surrender to. It became usable, productive. Then came gas lighting, burning in the streets and shops, and finally electric light, casting away the old shadows. No longer ruled by the slow breathing of the sun and moon, humanity's sleep began to compress. Industrialization sealed the shift. Factory bells and train schedules replaced roosters and seasons. The 8-hour shift demanded the body's allegiance. Schools, offices, and modern medicine reinforced the idea that a full night's sleep meant one long, unbroken stretch. The watch between sleeps, once a gentle pause, a time for intimacy and introspection, was rebranded as insomnia. Restlessness became a pathology. The natural became unnatural. Yet the body remembers. Even now, many people wake in the dead of night for no reason. Eyes flutter open at 2 or 3 a.m. and they wonder what's wrong. But perhaps nothing is wrong. Perhaps it is the old rhythm still echoing, like the beat of a drum long silenced. Perhaps we are not broken, but merely mismatched with the world we've built. Modern sleep researchers have begun to uncover the layers lost beneath fluorescent ceilings and smartphone glow. Studies have shown that when participants live without artificial light, cut off from clocks and modern cues, they often revert to polyphasic sleep patterns naturally. First sleep, waking interval, second sleep. It returns like a song they once knew. This wasn't just a European phenomenon. In parts of pre-industrial Africa, in the Amazon, among Australian Aboriginal peoples, and even in early Islamic and Chinese writings, fragmented sleep was recorded. Rest came in waves. Sleep was not just for rest. It was a time for dreams, spirit, reflection. It belonged to no one's schedule. Even today, remnants of this ancient cycle exist in cultures that nap midday, or in older generations who rise in the night without fear. The Mediterranean siesta. The Japanese inamuri. The segmented rest of shepherds and sailors. Polyphasic sleep, once the global norm, has not died. It has only been hidden beneath alarms and calendars. There is something profoundly human about this forgotten rhythm. A way of resting that made room for quiet, for thought, for slow waking and gentle sleeping. A way of being that didn't see wakefulness at night as a problem but as a gift. A breath in the middle of night's long sentence. Perhaps as our days grow louder and our nights more full of artificial suns, we are yearning for that ancient space again. That pause, that hush, that moment where the world turns inward. A time not for sleep alone but for stillness. And maybe the sleepless among us are not broken but remembering. Maybe they are echoes of the past, the ones who lie awake while the world slumbers, not out of restlessness or disorder, but because their minds still drift along the contours of ancestral time. Maybe they are the descendants of night watchers, fire tenders, silent dreamers who once woke not in fear but in wonder. For what was the night but a vast open sea of mystery, and what was the waking hour but a chance to peer into it? In the deepest parts of winter, when darkness stretches its cold fingers over much of the world, the old patterns sometimes return without invitation. A person wakes before dawn, heart slow but mind alert, unsure why. The house is still, the air barely stirred. There is no cause for alarm. And yet they remain awake. They check their phone, frustrated perhaps, labeling this moment as insomnia. But if they knew the truth, if they understood that for most of human history this was a sacred hour, they might instead breathe slower, lean into the quiet and listen. In that hour, creativity once bloomed. Poets composed verses by firelight, priests meditated, and farmers recounted dreams they believed to be omens. Children listened to whispered folk tales that would never be written down. Mothers rocked infants while watching the moon slip behind bare branches. Lovers held one another in wordless reverence, aware that this middle-of-the-night space felt thinner somehow, closer to something divine. The line between sleep and waking wasn't as harsh then. People drifted into each state gently, without fear. Sleep wasn't a battle or a goal. It was a rhythm like breath or tide. And in that gentle rhythm, life unfolded more slowly. Waking in the night was not a break in sleep, but part of it. A cycle, not a rupture. Today's world, with its brilliant screens and demanding clocks, has made this ancient wisdom easy to forget. We push ourselves toward productivity, measure rest by how useful it makes us, and view time spent awake in darkness as something to fix. But maybe that sleeplessness is a vestige of something older, something deeply human. Maybe, like calluses that form where our ancestors once walked barefoot, our night wakings are reminders of a way of living that once served us well. There's quiet evidence of this in the way older people often wake early or sleep in segments, as if age peels back the layers of modernity and reveals the primal self beneath. In those who take naps in the afternoon not from laziness but from instinct. In artists and thinkers who swear their best ideas come in the blue hours, between midnight and morning. There's a kind of ancestral intimacy in returning to polyphasic sleep. It doesn't require isolation or radical change, just permission. Permission to wake without shame. Permission to use the watchful hour not to panic or scroll but to be still. To write. To pray. To sit in one's own presence. To feel connected to every ancestor who once sat quietly in that same stretch of time, eyes reflecting firelight, mind wandering the border between worlds. The history of sleep is not just a footnote in the story of human progress. It is a mirror of who we are and how we've changed. The shift from polyphasic to monophasic sleep is more than a practical adjustment. It reflects a deeper transformation in how we relate to time, to work, to rest, and to ourselves. It's a story of how the sun was replaced by clock towers, how firelight gave way to fluorescent brightness, and how the body's natural hum was drowned in the noise of progress. Yet that ancient rhythm is still inside us, coiled like a memory in the bones. In moments of silence it stirs. In the hush of early dawn, in the lull between dream and duty, it wakes. And so we may find ourselves returning, not out of nostalgia but out of need. Not to live as we once did, but to remember what we once knew. That sleep is not a rigid cage but a flowing dance. That there is wisdom in waking. That there is nothing wrong with silence. That time, especially in the dark, need not always be filled. For some, this knowledge changes everything. For others, it offers comfort in the night. But for all, it whispers the truth the modern world forgot. You are not alone in your sleeplessness. You are not broken. You are simply remembering. And in the quiet remembering, a gentle revolution begins. One not shouted from rooftops or inked in headlines, but lived in the margins of midnight. It is found in those who choose to dim the lights earlier, letting the shadows reclaim their ancient kingdom. In those who lie awake and no longer fight the wakefulness but greet it, as one greets an old friend arriving unannounced. In those who stop measuring sleep in hours and instead measure it in peace. This revolution does not demand the end of technology or a rejection of the modern world. It only asks that we listen, that we observe the rhythms our bodies have always known, that we allow sleep to become wild again, to step out of the factory clock and back into the forest, where the sky tells time and the body listens in kind. It asks us to remember that sleep was once not a problem to be solved, but a passage to be traveled. In monasteries tucked away in the mountains of Japan and Tibet, monks still rise in the night for silent meditations, tapping into the same timeless interval once revered in medieval Europe. In the Arctic winter, where the sun vanishes for weeks, indigenous families gather together, sleeping in shifts, keeping fire and story alive in the dark. In rural India, some elders still sit awake under stars before returning to their second sleep. No alarm necessary. Across oceans and generations, these practices still live, sometimes whispered, sometimes bold, as evidence that the ancient ways were never fully lost, only quieted. Even in the heart of modern cities, some have begun to reclaim this forgotten rhythm. They call it segmented sleep, biphasic rest, or simply middle-night wakefulness. Forums and articles fill with people wondering why they wake at the same hour each night, and others respond not with remedies but with recognition. There is comfort in the collective, a shared knowing. Perhaps that is how all human wisdom survives. Not in books or institutions, but in the body and in the stories we tell about it. And so, slowly the world begins to remember. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough. Enough to pass the knowledge forward. To teach the next generation that the night is not the enemy, and sleep is not a task to be mastered. That there is grace in rising at midnight to think, to feel, to breathe. That our ancestors were not lost in ignorance, but were tuned to a different tempo. One that moved in waves and silence rather than in buzz and schedule. Somewhere, a sleepless historian sits in a quiet room lit only by a single lamp. Outside, the city slumbers. Inside, pages turn. Old manuscripts, travel logs, journal entries, each one a key. A window into the past where someone, centuries ago, woke in the same hour and wrote by candlelight. They write not to complain, not to diagnose, but to speak, to make sense of the in-between. And in this historian's notes, scattered and half-formed, something ancient lives again. A way of seeing the night not as a void, but as a landscape. One with trails and resting places and hidden wells of thought. The body stretches. The mind drifts. The lamp flickers. Outside, the stars remain exactly where they have always been, quiet witnesses to the ages of sleep and waking. They do not hurry. They do not judge. They have seen every rhythm rise and fall, every shepherd's watch, every monk's vigil, every child's night terror, every dreamer's dawn. And now once again they see you, awake, not alone, not broken, only remembering. The air in the room has stilled, thick with a silence that isn't empty but brimming with the quiet energy of time unfolding. The sleepless historian leans back, listening, not for noise but for something older than sound. In the stillness, there is the whisper of parchment, the echo of footsteps on cold monastery stone, the far-off murmur of a mother humming in the dark as she rocks her child back to sleep. It is as though history is breathing with them, not behind but beside. Not gone but folded into the space between the ticks of the clock. They wonder how many others are awake at this same hour across the world, how many lights burn gently in quiet corners, where someone else is reading, thinking, aching, wondering why they too have woken in the black of night. The historian knows now there's no simple answer. It's not always anxiety, not always illness, not always some chemical fault. Sometimes it's memory. Memory older than the individual. Memory housed not in words but in rhythm, muscle, instinct. A deep knowing as old as firelight in bone. For centuries, the waking hour was seen as a gift. A time to meet oneself in the dark. A chance to feel the world without the glare of day. Even dreams were different then. People recorded them as messages, visitations, fragments of something divine that could only reach them in the deep pocket between first and second sleep. In the old world, dreams were not just phenomena to be explained but roads to be walked. The historian has read enough to know. There were entire cultures that planned their day based on what they dreamed in that sacred middle hour. The gods, they believed, spoke clearest when the night was deepest and the mind freshly stirred. Tonight, the historian lets the candle burn low. There is no urgency, no rush to force sleep, no guilt in the stillness. Instead, there is trust, in the body's ancient pattern, in the quiet intelligence of slowness. And when the first pale hints of morning brush the edges of the sky, they will feel it like something returning. Not the start of a day, but the continuation of a rhythm that never really ended. They may lie down again. They may not. But either way, they are not chasing or resisting. They are simply being. And in that choice, in that surrender to a pattern long buried and newly uncovered, they are part of a lineage more vast than any family tree. The lineage of those who kept watch when others slept. Those who found clarity not in daylight, but in the hush between sleeps. This night, like all nights, is layered. It carries the imprint of 1,000 ancestors. It echoes with the voices of those who once stepped out beneath starlight to breathe and think and dream. It holds within it the weight of lost centuries and the quiet persistence of memory. And somewhere within it, in a small room, the sleepless historian finally places their pen down. Not finished, just ready to rest. The pen rests on the desk like a final whisper, the ink still wet with the weight of thought. The candle beside it burns low, its wax folding in on itself, the flame dancing softer now, no longer bold but calm, like a breath just before sleep. Outside, the sky is no longer black but a deep violet, the stars beginning to vanish behind the curtain of approaching dawn. The historian watches the dim light through the window, not with urgency but with reverence. The slow return of color to the world feels like an ancient procession, a ceremony that has happened every day since the beginning of time. There is a kind of silence in this hour that isn't emptiness but the most honest kind of fullness, full of the things that usually go unnoticed, the things too quiet for daytime. The creak of wood settling into itself, the distant bark of a dog, a breeze that moves the trees but not the leaves. And in that stillness, the historian feels the presence of everyone who has ever lived this hour. The quiet farmers in 14th century France stirring embers back to life. The lone scribe in a Syrian monastery resuming his translation under flickering lamplight. The sailor adrift in the dark seas of the 1600s, watching for land and praying for safe passage. The enslaved woman in 18th century Virginia, whispering a lullaby she will never write down. The tired father in Edo period Japan counting coins beneath his oil lamp, too poor to sleep long but rich in memory. All of them linked, not by language, not by nation, but by this hour, this sacred watch when time folds inward and a strange kind of clarity stirs. It isn't insomnia. something older, something so natural we forgot it. The historian does not mourn the passing of those centuries, but neither do they celebrate their loss. They accept what has changed. The rhythms of the modern world pulse differently now, but still there are ways to listen. Still, the body remembers. And tonight, in this soft hour between wakefulness and dreaming, they feel that memory stronger than ever, as though the earth itself is breathing through them. They rise quietly, not with purpose but with softness, and move through the dim room without turning on a single artificial light. Their fingers brush the edge of a book. Their eyes follow the lines of a shadow dancing along the wall. And finally, when the first gold begins to streak across the sky, thin and pale, like a painter's first stroke, they return to their bed. No alarms, no clocks, just the weight of blankets, the softness of breath, the slow sinking into warmth. And there, without thought, without fear of time lost or time wasted, they close their eyes. The second sleep begins. The room now holds a silence so complete it feels sacred, as though time itself has agreed to wait. The faintest sounds of the waking world begin to emerge. Somewhere beyond the walls, a cart creaks over cobblestones, a bird trills a single cautious note, and from far away, the hush of a city rising echoes like waves brushing an unseen shore. But here in this room, beneath the soft breath of linen and dusk-tinged memory, the historian dreams. The second sleep is not the heavy, desperate plunge of someone who has finally given in to exhaustion. It is lighter, more curious, closer to that floating state between sea and sky. In it, the past has no edges. The historian walks through fog-bound forests where ancient trees whisper in tongues no longer spoken, across marble floors that echo with the footsteps of scribes, through doorways carved in stone, where women and men once whispered dreams under oil lamps and stars. They are not a visitor here. They belong as much as those who came before. There is no border between their breath and the world they dream of. Here time unravels like ribbon. The historian meets a young Egyptian woman crouched beside a reed basket, humming a lullaby older than language. A Babylonian astronomer shows them a tablet scratched with stars. A medieval midwife in Prague recites a prayer as she boils water, preparing for a birth she hopes will be easy. A philosopher from Luoyang speaks of silence, not as absence but as a shape the world takes when it's listening. In each figure, the historian sees not facts or dates, but presence. Not artifacts, but lives. And then they are in a library, but not one that ever truly existed. It is a place the dream built from every library ever known. 1,000 scrolls whispering against one another, oak tables scarred with ink and time, windows that show not sky but memory. Every book is unlabeled but instantly understood. There are no signs, no indexes, no need for them. Knowledge in this place is not organized but lived. It calls to the historian not with logic but with longing. They pass a book that smells of sea salt and cedar. Inside, the dreams of sailors who never returned. Another, wrapped in silk, warm to the touch. It hums with the laughter of market women in 9th century Samarkand. Another still, heavy and cold, inked in soot and bone. It bleeds the silence of plague years and winter fire. They turn pages not with their hands but with their breath. Every inhalation reveals a memory not theirs, and yet somehow it is. Every exhalation writes a new line into the book that carries their name. And in the center of the library, a candle, tall, unmelted, endless, burns with a flame that shifts from gold to blue to violet. The historian stands before it, watching how the light dances on the floor, how the shadows don't move away from it but toward it, drawn to the flame as if it were a story they long to remember. They do not ask questions here. There is no need. Everything is known. When the historian finally stirs again, the second sleep easing them back into the world of walls and windows, they feel no confusion. No abrupt jolt into consciousness. Just a slow return like a tide flowing back to sea. Their limbs are warm, their breath steady. The light outside is full now, not the harsh glare of noon, but the soft gold of early morning. A bird sings again. A kettle hisses. A floorboard creaks. The world is not waiting for them. It has simply kept on turning. And they rise, not rushed, not late, not worried. Their hands move as if remembering the shapes of ancient things, their feet steady on wooden floors. The room is the same as it was, and yet something is different. The pen on the desk, the wax pooled on the table, the book left half open. All speak of a night lived, not lost. The historian smiles, the kind of smile that belongs not to joy or sorrow, but to recognition. They are not alone. They never were. And as they walk quietly toward the day, their eyes hold the trace of a flame that never went out. The morning air drifting through the open window carries with it the scent of dew and dust, of things freshly stirred. Light now pools gently across the historian's desk, turning the page of a forgotten notebook into something almost holy. There's no rush to dress, no urgency in motion. The historian moves slowly, as though each action is a ritual, each moment part of some ancient rhythm long buried beneath schedules and alarms. Outside, the world is already in motion. Carts rolling across uneven stone, traders calling out the day's offerings, children chasing one another through the alleys. But in this room, in this stillness left behind by the night, the historian carries something no one else can see. A memory not just of dreams, but of something deeper, older. A trace of the sacred rhythm that once bound all human lives together like breath and tide. They dress simply, tying each piece of cloth with the ease of repetition, their hands remembering what the mind doesn't need to command. The tea they prepare is strong and quiet, its steam rising like incense. And as they sip, the world outside and the world within seem for a rare moment to move in harmony. Not separate, not in conflict, but in conversation. There's a notebook on the edge of the table, its leather soft and worn with use. The historian opens it not to write, but to reread. Last night's thoughts still linger in the margins. Scraps of phrases half-formed, sketches of dreams, questions without answers. They trace the ink with a fingertip, not to revise but to remember. This too is part of the rhythm. A kind of thinking that lives beyond words. In the street below, someone laughs. A bird lands on the sill. Life presses forward as it always does. But the historian knows now that time is not a straight road. It loops and coils and circles back. It waits in dark corners. It whispers in the pauses between things. What was thought lost is never gone. It merely sleeps, until someone somewhere remembers how to listen. And today the historian does not feel tired. There will be another night. Another hour between sleeps. Another dream that opens the door to a forgotten library, a vanished song, a candle that burns with colors not found in flame. There will be more questions, more stories, more wondering. But for now, in the slow warmth of morning, they are simply present. Breathing. Awake. Alive. Later that day, as the sun arcs gently across the sky and shadows grow long on the floorboards, the historian finds themselves wandering beyond the confines of the room. The streets hum with ordinary life, vendors murmuring greetings, laundry snapping in the breeze, the sound of wheels over cobblestone echoing like distant thunder. Yet even here, among the familiar routines of the day, they feel it, that invisible thread still trailing behind them from the night, a thread stitched through centuries, through every sleepless soul who ever sat quietly in the dark listening. They walk with no destination, letting the shape of the world guide them. Through the quiet market square where the air smells of spice and flower, past a narrow passage lined with ivy and moss, and finally to the steps of the old archives, an unremarkable building to most, but to the historian a threshold. Here knowledge is not dead. It rests, coiled, waiting to be awakened. They push open the heavy door, its hinges sighing like a memory long untouched, and step inside. Dust hangs in the air like smoke, sunlight cutting through in golden spears. Shelves groan with the weight of centuries. There is no sound but their own footfall. The archivist glances up, nods, and returns to a brittle folio. No words are exchanged, they are not needed. The historian moves to a familiar alcove near the back, where the air is cooler and the shadows thicker. They pull down a manuscript wrapped in silk, its binding cracked, its pages whispering as they turn. It is a dream record, written in the 13th century by a monk who claimed to receive visions only during his second sleep. The writing is delicate, drifting between Latin and a strange dialect from the hills of Asturias. The dreams are strange, of course, but not mad. They speak of stars falling in reverse, of voices rising from stones, of silent cities beneath the sea. The historian copies a passage into their notebook, the ink flowing easily, their hand moving not just with skill, but with familiarity, as if they've written it before in another life or another hour of wakefulness. They pause now and then to listen, to the creak of shelves, the ticking of the old clock near the entrance, the breath of time itself. Hours pass unnoticed. When they finally step back into the sunlight, the day is already folding inward. Children are being called inside. Lamps are being lit. The blue of twilight is settling over rooftops and window panes. The historian breathes deeply, letting the cool air fill them. They do not hurry home. By the time they return, the room is dim and waiting. Everything is where it was. The pen, the candle, the book half open like a mouth ready to speak. They light the flame again and sit. Not to chase sleep, not to fight wakefulness, but to honor the rhythm that now pulses through them like a second heartbeat. The night unfolds slowly. First sleep comes quietly like a warm hand on the shoulder. The historian welcomes it. Hours later, their eyes open not with panic but with calm. The candle has burned down a little further. The sky outside is silver with stars. And in this in-between hour, where dreams rest just behind the eyes and thought drifts like a tide, the historian begins to write again. Not because they must, but because this hour belongs to them, as it always did. Their hand moves almost automatically now, as if the ink itself remembers the stories more than the conscious mind. Each line flows into the next, not hurried, not labored, but steady, like breath, like a pulse that has waited centuries to be heard again. Outside, the stars have shifted. A few clouds drift across the moon, thin and slow, like smoke on water. The city has fallen into its second silence, the deep one, the true one. No carriages, no footsteps, not even the creak of shutters. Just the breath of night and the gentle scratch of pen on paper. The historian does not pause to reflect on what they're writing. Not yet. Reflection will come later, in daylight, when words are weighed and sorted and categorized into thoughts. But now, in this sacred hour, the historian writes not with the intellect but with the memory of something older. The kind of memory that lives beneath speech, beneath bone, beneath even blood. The memory of a species who once watched the stars and did not try to name them, only listened. They write of an old woman in Anatolia who taught her daughters to wake during the second sleep to speak to the dead. Of a trader in Carthage who believed he met gods in his dreams if he fell asleep twice before dawn. Of a physician in northern India who prescribed not herbs or chants but silence and moonlight between midnight and 3. Each fragment is not fiction, nor entirely history. It is a kind of truth found only when one walks quietly between the walls of night. The candle flickers. The air is cooler now, touched by the quiet exhale of approaching dawn. The historian leans back, eyes tired but not strained. A comfort settles in their chest, not of accomplishment, not of completion, but of alignment. They are no longer working against time, but with it. They feel what the world has forgotten, that time bends in the dark. It folds like cloth and drapes itself over the shoulders of those who dare to sit still long enough to feel it. They do not know how long they've been writing. The concept of hours has faded. But their body begins to lean toward rest again, a pull as gentle and natural as gravity. The pen is laid aside. The notebook remains open, the ink shining faintly. The flame is cupped by its own glow, warm and soft. And in the silence, the historian moves once again to the bed, receives them without question. They close their eyes not because they are told to, but because the rhythm of the world invites it. And sleep returns, not as an escape, but as a continuation. A door quietly opening. This is not modern sleep. This is ancestral, cyclical, sacred. It is sleep that listens, sleep that speaks back, sleep that remembers every dream that ever mattered. And just before the historian drifts fully into the dark again, they feel it. That invisible library, that weightless place of memory drawing closer once more. A place outside time. A place where every soul who has ever woken in the night walks slowly, silently, side by side. In the deep fold of the second sleep, the historian does not so much dream as return. There is no threshold this time, no library of dust or door swinging open on forgotten hinges. Instead, they are simply there, standing within a vast plain of silver mist and cool breath, where sound does not echo, yet nothing feels empty. Around them are shapes, familiar in the way old songs are before they're remembered, men and women in cloaks of woven silence, barefoot children moving between them like whispers, monks and merchants and midwives and mothers. None of them speak. None of them need to. They are all the same, though born across millennia, bound not by borders or blood but by the quiet act of waking in the middle of the night and wondering why. One by one, the figures begin to fade, not vanish but dissolve into the mist as though returning to the deep current beneath it. The historian walks forward, their feet leaving no trace. There is no fear, no curiosity, only a calm that settles in the lungs like warm breath. A figure remains in the distance, not clearer than the rest but more present. As the historian approaches, they realize it is someone they do not know and yet entirely recognize. The figure smiles, not with lips, but with eyes that carry the memory of stars. "You've come back," the figure says without speaking. "We were always here." The historian reaches out, not to touch but to acknowledge. A gesture not of greeting but of return. Around them the mist begins to shimmer. Not with light but with memory. Every step of every person who ever woke and wondered in the dark now stirs in the mist. Stories, songs, fragments of thought. An old man counting prayer beads beside a fireless hearth. A girl in Mali humming lullabies to herself after her mother slept. A Roman guard scratching symbols into his shield as the watchtower burned quietly behind him. A woman in Scylla tracing the shape of the moon in ink as her husband marched off to war. All of them layered here, not trapped but waiting. Always waiting. In this sleep time has no shape. Minutes do not follow hours. There is no sunrise. There is only presence. The historian kneels and places a hand to the mist. It ripples, and within it they see the candles still flickering in the waking world, the ink still damp on the notebook, the first golden edge of dawn pressing its way against the horizon. The figure beside them nods again, and the sound is like turning pages. "You will forget most of this," it says, "but not all." The historian wants to respond, but the moment is already softening, stretching, fading like the final echo in a marble hall. The figures disappear, not lost, but rejoined with the current that never stops flowing. The mist becomes light, and the light becomes breath, and the breath becomes a slow, steady rhythm of waking. Eyes open. The room is pale and cool, the light of morning filtering through a gauze of curtain. The candle is spent. The notebook sits where it was as if untouched, but the ink has dried. A breeze stirs the edge of a page. Somewhere far off, a bell rings, metal on air, deep and soft. The historian lies still for a while, listening not to the bell but to the silence beneath it. A silence that feels less like absence now and more like memory. The body is rested, the mind quiet, and in the space between waking and rising, they carry not the image of the dream, but its weight, like a warmth left behind by someone who once sat beside you. They rise again, but not as they did yesterday. Today they know, intimately, quietly, that this rhythm is not broken, not gone, not strange. It has only been waiting. The historian moved slowly through the morning, not out of weariness but reverence, as though each act, rinsing the face, steeping tea, opening the shutters, were part of a sacred sequence that stretched beyond centuries. The world outside was bright now, ordinary to the unknowing eye. The clatter of hooves, the muted call of a fruit seller, a dog barking at nothing in particular. But to the historian, everything shimmered faintly with something remembered. The light fell differently. The air felt older. They sat at their desk again, not to begin anything new, but to return. The notebook still lay open where it had been left, its pages bearing the night's writing like gentle footprints on untouched snow. The words were theirs, and yet as they read them, they felt as though someone else had written them. Someone they had been, someone who had existed for only a brief, precious hour between one sleep and the next. A self closer to the marrow of history than to its records. A self who remembered what others had forgotten. They did not rush to add more. The pen remained still. Instead, they closed the notebook and placed it gently atop a stack of older ones, each filled not with answers but echoes. They knew now that their task was not to chase conclusions, but to become fluent in the rhythm. To listen. To observe the night not as absence but as presence. Not as the opposite of day but as its twin. The rest of the day moved with a quiet grace. The historian visited the market and watched how people negotiated over turnips and wool, their voices rising and falling like a familiar song. They paused at the old fountain, where a child dropped a feather in the water and watched it spin, enchanted. They stopped by the steps of the chapel, not to enter but to feel the cool stone beneath their hand, to let memory pass between fingertip and granite. By evening, the sky turned the color of ash and rose, and the first lamps flickered on in the windows of the city. The historian prepared their evening meal with simple care. Bread, a few olives, a wedge of firm cheese. No grand celebration, no feast. Just enough. They ate slowly, chewing each bite like a prayer. When the sun had gone and the last bird call fell quiet, they lit a single candle again. Its flame danced in the still air. The historian wrote nothing, said nothing, read nothing. They simply sat with the silence. And in time sleep came, not as surrender but as an arrival. A return to the invisible corridor between waking worlds. A drift into the breath between days. The candle flickered. The shadows lengthened. And somewhere far away in the part of the world still forgotten by clocks, someone else stirred in their sleep, waking briefly into the quiet hour. They did not know it yet, but they too were part of the rhythm. Part of the great, patient current beneath time. The rhythm, ancient and unwavering, carried the historian into that silent ocean between first and second sleep, where thought no longer clings to the edges of the day but flows freely, dreamlike and unburdened. In that stillness there were no rules, only remembering. Not the remembering of facts or dates, but of feelings, impressions, the soft pulse of something deeply human and long overlooked. The historian found themselves once more standing in that vast and mist-laden place. The same dream, perhaps, or the continuation of one never truly left. But this time the air was clearer, the outlines of the figures more solid, their presence heavier with quiet meaning. The faces were not familiar, yet the historian felt no fear. They were companions across the veil of centuries, drawn together not by chance but by a shared pattern. All of them had once woken in the night and listened, and remembered. A woman with ash-streaked cheeks offered the historian a bowl of water and gestured toward a pool where stars floated beneath the surface. They knelt and cupped the water, and it shimmered with images, not of battles or kings, but of moments small and overlooked. A mother braiding her daughter's hair before dawn in a hill fort, a shepherd tracing constellations with his staff during a lonely midnight watch, a scribe in Alexandria writing by lamplight long after others had gone to bed, scribbling not for patrons but for himself. These were the stories that the day forgot, the ones that didn't make it into monuments but lived on in breath and shadow. The historian rose and walked among these visions, not as an observer but as one of them. And though no words passed between the dreamers gathered there, their presence was a conversation deeper than sound. Every step they took was like stepping through time, through layer after layer of unspoken history. The historian began to understand that this was not merely a dream, not even just a memory. It was a map. a woven tapestry of all the unseen lives that had pulsed beneath the surface of recorded time. And sleep, or rather waking within sleep, was the thread that tied them all together. Then came the bell, distant and low, not a warning, not an end, but a call. It rang out across the mist, and the vision dissolved, not with panic, but with peace. The pool dimmed, the stars within it flickering out one by one. The companions of the dream turned slowly away, returning to their silence, fading gently like mist on the moor. The historian felt themselves drawn upward, as though carried by a current they had always trusted but never named. Their eyes opened once more to the quiet gray of the early morning. The sky was pale with coming light, and the air was still. The candle had long since burned to its base, a pool of wax solidified like frozen breath. The notebook lay beside them, blank but full, as though the dreams themselves had soaked into the pages. They did not rush to write, nor did they try to hold the images tightly. The historian had learned now that memory, like water, moves best when left ungrasped. They rose and washed their face with cold water, the shock of it realigning them with the waking world. And as they prepared again for the simplicity of the day, tea, bread, the rustle of city life outside, they carried with them the understanding that the night no longer belonged only to rest. It was a second life, a sacred one. Others would ask them, perhaps, why they seemed more rested now, more alert, more attuned. And they might answer with a shrug, or with a smile that didn't require explanation. Some truths were not meant to be spoken aloud. They were meant to be lived, felt in the marrow, and remembered only in the spaces between one heartbeat and the next. And when night came again, as it always would, the historian would welcome it, not as darkness but as passage, not as absence but as return, to the rhythm, to the quiet, to the dream that never ends. The night returned as it always did, softly, without announcement. The city quieted beneath its weight, not out of obedience but familiarity, the way a child grows still in the arms of a parent. The historian lit the candle not out of habit now, but out of instinct, as if the flame were a key, unlocking the hours untouched by daylight. They no longer feared the pause between sleeps. It had become a calling as natural as breath, as certain as the moon. They did not write immediately. The pen rested beside the notebook, but the historian did not reach for it. Instead, they sat with the silence, watching the flame. It moved without urgency, swaying in the unseen currents of the room, casting gentle shadows that wavered like memory itself. The historian's gaze wandered, not just around the room, but through it to the spaces beyond it, where time felt thinner, more honest. They closed their eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. And the listening brought images, not dreams, not quite. A weaver in a hut of packed clay, her fingers dancing across the threads long after midnight, weaving stories into cloth. A boy on the step tracing shapes into the dirt with a stick, humming to a rhythm only he can hear, while the stars watch with ancient patience. A sailor on the deck of a creaking vessel staring at the horizon with cracked lips and burning eyes, whispering to the wind as if it might speak back. A monk in a stone cell, lips moving silently around verses that echo through his bones rather than his ears. The historian could feel them all, not as fiction, not as metaphor, but as presences, as truths too often buried by the noise of daylight. They were all echoes of a human rhythm older than language. And in the space between sleeps, they all came closer. When the historian finally opened their eyes, the candle had shortened, but its flame still held. The city outside murmured in its second silence, the deepest one. The historian reached for the pen now, not because they had something to say, but because something had asked to be heard. Their hand moved across the page in soft, looping lines. The ink formed sentences that belonged to no one and everyone. Descriptions of people who may never have existed, and yet whose feelings were as real as the ground. There were no names, only moments. No plot, only rhythm. A girl stepping into a river before dawn. A widow lighting a lantern and placing it by the window just once each year. A farmer waking from a second sleep and praying not to a god but to the soil itself. The writing was slow, deliberate, tender. When the candle burned out, the historian did not light another. Instead, they sat in the dark, the warmth of the wax still fresh on their fingers, the ink still drying. They could feel the pull of the second sleep, not as an escape but as a homecoming. There was nothing dramatic, nothing grand. Only a quiet folding inward, like the closing of petals before the cold. They laid down, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with surrender. And once more the silence received them, not with answers, but with stories. The silence wrapped around the historian like the soft folds of a well-worn cloak, and the boundary between the waking world and the dream world thinned, stretched, and finally dissolved altogether. Sleep did not take them, it welcomed them, remembered them. The second sleep came as it always had for generations untold, not as an interruption, but as a continuation of something older than cities and empires, older than the first writing etched into clay or stone. They stood again in the dream, though even calling it that now seemed inadequate. It felt too real, too measured, too deliberate to be dismissed as fantasy. The air was cool and carried a scent like rain before it falls. Above, the sky held neither moon nor stars, but a faint glow, as if the light of all the ages shimmered just beyond view. The plain they walked was endless, but not empty. It was populated by the presence of time itself, layered, dense, and humming with a music too low for the ear but perfectly tuned to the soul. This time the historian was not alone. Others were walking as well, scattered across the unseen paths of that dream country. Some wore the robes of priests or scribes, others the furs of hunters or the sandals of travelers. Some were cloaked in garments of silk, others in simple woven cloth. And though they came from distant lands and forgotten centuries, they all walked with the same quiet purpose, eyes forward, faces peaceful. They, too, had woken in the deep hours of the night and heard something calling them. Beyond the veil of sleep, the historian stepped beside a man who bore the posture of age but the eyes of youth. Neither spoke, but they moved together across the mist-laced ground, their feet never quite touching it. In the distance, a great tree loomed, so tall its branches vanished into the dark above, so wide its roots seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the world. Around it, others gathered in a hush, not to pray, not to kneel, but to witness. To be near it as one might sit beside a fire that has burned for thousands of years. When the historian and their companion reached the base of the tree, they too stopped. The bark shimmered with carvings, not words but shapes, figures, and spirals that moved gently under the eyes like waves. If one stared too long, they began to shift, revealing stories in motion. A birth beside a river, a death under falling snow. Lovers hiding from a war they had no part in. Children chasing fireflies in a time before language. The historian touched the bark and felt 1,000 pulses ripple beneath their fingertips, like distant drums. The tree did not speak, did not need to. Its presence alone was enough. After a time, perhaps minutes, perhaps hours, perhaps centuries, the historian turned away, carrying with them the imprint of the tree not in their memory but in their marrow. The path home opened behind them without a sound. They walked it slowly, deliberately, aware now that every step back toward waking was also a step deeper into understanding. This rhythm, this dream, this ancient space between sleeps, it was not just a personal sanctuary. It was a shared inheritance. And with each return, the historian joined a lineage longer and wider than any history ever written. Their eyes fluttered open just as the first gold edge of morning touched the windowsill. The city outside was stirring once more, murmurs rising, pots clattering, water sloshing in basins. The historian sat up, hands folded quietly in their lap, and breathed in the new day. The notebook waited, but there was no rush. What had been seen in the night could not all be written. Not yet. Some things must settle like ash before they can be handled. Instead, they stood and opened the window. The air was sharp and clean, and somewhere a bell was ringing, clear and slow. They smiled. Not for anyone to see, not for any reason that could be explained, but simply because they knew the rhythm would return again. And when it did, they would be waiting, as they always had. And so the day unfolded with a serenity that did not require effort. The historian moved through its hours not as one racing toward a goal, but as a careful listener, attentive to the smallest details. The way sunlight slipped across the tiled floor in angled fragments, how steam curled from a mug of water just before it cooled, how footsteps in the street below echoed in a rhythm almost like breathing. It was not that the world had changed. It was that the historian could now feel the layers beneath it, as if time itself were no longer hidden behind veils of distraction but walking beside them, arm in arm. They spent some hours by the window watching the movements of life as it passed. A boy ran with a wooden hoop. A woman leaned from her balcony to shake crumbs from a cloth, scattering them to a chorus of eager birds. A group of men stood near a cart, laughing in low bursts, their faces weathered by years of work but softened by warmth. There was nothing dramatic in these moments, nothing worthy of chronicling in great books. And yet the historian understood. This too was history. This too belonged to the quiet record of being. Later, as dusk softened the corners of the buildings and painted the stones in warm amber, the historian returned to their desk, not out of obligation but invitation. They opened the notebook to the same blank page where the night had last left them. This time, their hand moved with the ease of someone who did not fear forgetting, because they had come to trust that the deepest truths always returned when the world was still enough to hear them. They did not write about kings or battles. They wrote about a shepherd who had once dreamed of a voice calling him by name and who had risen from his straw mat to find only the night air, thick with silence. They wrote of a woman in a mountain village who believed the moon was a mirror for all the things we've buried. They wrote of a monk who spent years transcribing a single line of poetry because he believed each stroke of ink whispered a prayer to the bones of the earth. None of these people had names, but their lives were steady candles burning in the draftless hall of history. As the final light of day ebbed away and the city became once again a hush of flickering windows and distant footsteps, the historian stood and set aside the pen. It was enough for now. Outside, the wind picked up, not fierce but gentle, like the voice of someone reminding you they're still there. The stars blinked into view one by one, each a pinprick in the veil that separates now from then. And high above, the moon climbed slowly, without pride, without rush, its face older than memory. When the time came, the historian again lit the candle, prepared for sleep. But it was not an ending. It never was. It was simply a pause, a return, a falling inward. They lay beneath the thin blanket, the scent of wax and paper lingering in the air, the quiet settling like dust upon the floorboards. And then, as expected, the gentle current began to pull. Not violently, not abruptly, just enough to let the mind slip free of the body's mooring. Just enough to drift once more into that vast and invisible world beyond the veil, where ancient companions waited in silence, where the great tree still stood, and where the forgotten heartbeat of time echoed softly, endlessly, in the space between first and second sleep. The flame flickered. The breath slowed. The rhythm returned like the tide, familiar and inevitable, and the historian welcomed it without hesitation. The transition from the outer world to the inner one no longer required resistance or surrender. It simply was. They no longer reached for sleep. They moved with it as a dancer might turn with music they've known since childhood. And as the flicker of the candle dimmed behind closed eyes, the great silence opened again. But this time the dream did not begin with mist or visions. It began with sound, distant at first, like footsteps across sand, then clearer, a heartbeat. Not the historian's own, but many, layered and overlapping, a pulse like the beating of wings or drums stretched across time. It was the sound of life moving unseen behind walls of parchment and dust. The historian found themselves walking through a vast corridor not built by hands, but shaped by memory. The walls were made of voices, and the floor was woven from thoughts long unspoken. Each step echoed, not with noise but with meaning. They passed through archways where languages shimmered like heat, where lost tongues whispered into their ears words that carried no modern equivalent. Terms for kinds of silence, for kinds of grief, for kinds of love that had long since gone unnamed. In one corner, a boy from ancient Anatolia wrote a letter to a friend he'd never meet. In another, an old woman in sub-Saharan Africa hummed into the dusk as she pounded grain, her voice blending with the rhythm of generations before her. These were the hallways of forgotten knowledge, not of kings or warriors, but of ordinary lives whose quiet acts of living had once sent ripples through the world. The historian knew now that polyphasic sleep, this ancient rhythm of waking within sleep, was not merely a curiosity of past human behavior. It was a bridge. In those silent hours when the world forgets its noise, there exists a passage into the collective dream, the unconscious library, the deep archive of human time. The second sleep, the waking dream, was the key to memory deeper than their own. They found themselves pausing beside a fountain made not of water but of soft light, rising and falling in pulses. It was surrounded by figures, some with faces clear as a friend's, others with features blurred like stone worn by centuries of rain. One reached out and touched the historian's hand, not as a ghost but as a presence firm and warm. Their eyes spoke of things beyond language, not instructions but reminders, that all this dream, this waking, this rhythm, was not a discovery. It was a return. Something humanity had once known and, in its haste, had forgotten. When the historian turned back toward the path home, they did not feel sorrow or urgency. There was no sense of losing the dream. It would remain. It always did. It had been there in the lullabies whispered in clay homes before iron was forged. It had rested in the pauses between verses of forgotten songs. It had waited in the quiet between stories told beside dying fires, when voices grew low and no one spoke the truth aloud but everyone felt it. The return to waking was as smooth as the slipping of a boat into water. The candle had long since expired. The sky outside was pale with the blue that precedes dawn. The world, unaware of what had been traversed, turned over in its sleep. The historian lay still for a moment, breathing in the silence, holding it like a gift. Not to keep but to share. There would be another night, another dream, another gathering beneath the tree that bore the weight of a million stories. But for now it was enough to rise, to walk barefoot across the cold floor, to feel the body stretch and shift, to boil water and hold the cup between their palms. To write a single line in the notebook, not to record but to remember. To whisper a name they had not known they knew. Outside, a bird called to the coming day. The cup warmed their hands as dawn's light poured thinly through the window, painting long, soft streaks across the table and floor. The historian sat there for a long while without moving, the steam rising in gentle spirals, the silence of the world just beginning to break. Somewhere down the lane, shutters opened. Water sloshed into a basin. Someone coughed, not loudly, just a sound of living. But in the historian's heart, the dream still echoed, not as a memory, not as an image, but as a current flowing just beneath the surface of waking. They did not need to rush to capture it. The dream was not fleeting. It had sunk its roots into them now, like the tree from that strange, shared country beyond sleep. Everything around them, every object, every sound, seemed different somehow, as if the world had grown more transparent overnight. Or maybe it had always been this way and only now could they see it clearly. Even the grain of the wood beneath their cup seemed to ripple faintly with time, like the rings of a tree whose story was too vast to read in a single glance. They rose quietly and opened the window. The cool air moved around them like a question, brushing the inside of their wrist, the nape of their neck. The historian closed their eyes and listened, not to anything in particular, but to everything all at once. The footsteps, the breeze, the creaking of old stone, even the pause between the calls of waking birds. It was all part of the rhythm now. The waking life no longer felt so separate from the dreaming one. Each touched the other, like tides folding into each other in a great, slow dance. Later that day, the historian walked beyond the familiar streets, beyond the parts of the city where names and buildings lived. They followed the old paths, the half-forgotten ones that wound behind gardens and beneath quiet bridges, through alleyways where the walls bore faint traces of chalk and soot from generations past. They watched children playing in the dust and old men resting beneath faded awnings, their silence as weighty as any book in the historian's collection. But they were not walking to observe. They were walking to remember. Because now they understood what had been waiting in those long nights between sleeps, what the ancestors had once known and practiced not as a technique but as a natural state. Polyphasic sleep wasn't an invention, nor was it a strange old custom. It was the natural ebb and flow of consciousness. One part waking, one part drifting, one part listening to a deeper pulse that modern life had long since smothered with its noise and hunger. In that space between the first and second sleeps, the mind could travel. And where it went, it carried not just dreams but threads that connected the present to the past, the living to the dead, the forgotten to the remembered. They returned home before the light turned too harsh, with dust on their shoes and a strange comfort in their chest. They didn't need to explain it. Not everyone would understand. Most had forgotten how to listen. But the historian didn't feel alone. Not anymore. That evening, as dusk bled into night and the sky once again took on the velvet weight of twilight, the historian prepared the candle and the room with the same quiet care as always. They folded the blanket. They closed the shutters halfway, letting just enough air in to stir the air but not enough to distract the senses. They sat with the notebook, though they did not write. Not yet. Just that they waited. And in that waiting the world softened again. The light dimmed. The thoughts slowed. The deep pull came, not sleep but the passage before it, the wide and hidden stairway that led not down but inward. The historian closed their eyes. They didn't ask where they were going. They didn't need to know. The rhythm would guide them. The dream would return. And somewhere beyond the reach of firelight and walls, the tree waited too, its ancient branches whispering through unseen winds, its roots tangled in the memories of thousands of sleepers. It would be there, as it always was, steady and patient, bearing silent witness to every soul who wandered its way through the hush between sleeps. The night deepened. The hush settled around them like a familiar companion, the kind who didn't need to speak to be understood. As the historian slipped beyond the veil of waking, the rhythm of breath and the softness of stillness marked the quiet departure into that middle world once again. There was no border, no sudden shift, only the slow dissolution of the weight of consciousness, and then the return of something older and more expansive. They found themselves once more not in a dream but in that layered place between. The air was thick with presence but not crowded. It welcomed them with the same steadiness as the last time, and though nothing had changed, everything felt subtly different. The landscape shifted gently like sand dunes under wind. It responded not to thought but to intention. And as the historian stood beneath that weightless sky with no stars and no sun, the path before them unfolded in silence. They walked for a long time, though time didn't measure itself here. The steps fell without effort, and the world listened to each one. There were others again, though distant this time, shadows moving at the edge of awareness. Some wore the attire of ages far removed from the historian's own. A figure with a bronze circlet across her brow, another with sandals made from woven reeds, one cloaked in thick animal hides, bearing a carved totem against his chest. No one approached. No one needed to. The presence of all was enough. They all knew the same song even if they hummed it in different keys. Eventually, the landscape gave way to something vast and open. A flat expanse where the ground mirrored the sky in soft reflections like shallow water. It wasn't cold nor wet, only perfectly still. In that space, stories emerged. Not as words, not even as pictures, but as full sensations. The historian felt them as textures in the air. A mother in Mesopotamia laying her child to sleep after watching the stars rise. A monk in northern China copying a scroll by oil lamp, pausing to steady his breath between strokes. A girl in ancient Mesoamerica dreaming of a jaguar, her breath rising and falling as the coals in her family's hearth whispered into darkness. Each of these echoes passed through the historian like a memory not their own. Each had a rhythm, a heartbeat, a space where first sleep had given way to wakefulness, not for action but for contemplation, for connection. They realized then that polyphasic sleep wasn't just a pattern of rest. It had been the sacred interval for humanity to touch its own soul. In those dim hours when the world lay quiet and untouched by urgency, people had once shared space with ancestors, gods, questions, and dreams alike. The historian understood now why the second sleep had once been revered. They walked until the expanse gave way to that familiar immense tree again, its branches stretching outward like fingers across time. This time they approached with no hesitation. As they stood beneath it, they felt the deep thrum of the roots far below and the delicate sigh of leaves above. The tree was not a symbol. It was a being vast and ancient, the keeper of all that humanity had lived but forgotten. It had no voice, but it spoke in stillness. The historian touched the bark and it responded, not with visions but with presence. They felt the warmth of every person who had come here before in their second sleep, every sleeper who had wandered this place believing themselves alone. It was not a sacred place in the religious sense. It was sacred in the way that water is to thirst. It was the space humans had always needed, before schedules, before alarms, before the illusion that rest must be earned. And then, as always, the return began. The tree faded into mist, not because it was gone, but because it had been seen enough. For now, the world of the second sleep folded gently inward, and the historian's body remembered breath, remembered blankets, remembered the ache in joints and the softness of cotton. Their eyes opened again in the familiar dark of the room, the last embers of the candle now cool wax, the outside world wrapped in pre-dawn silence. But something inside had changed in a way they could not easily name. There was no grand revelation, no thunder of meaning. Only clarity, peace. The knowing that the rhythm continued, that they were not out of place in the world, only slightly out of step, and that now they'd remembered the dance. The historian lay still for a while, listening again. Not to noise, but to silence. The silence that connected sleepers across time. The silence that held stories unspoken. The silence that once, in every corner of the world, had opened itself up to anyone willing to listen between the hours, in the space between sleep. And then slowly they sat up, lit the first light of the morning, and picked up the pen. Not to capture the dream, but to mark its presence. To honor the rhythm. And to wait patiently once again for night. The pen hovered over the page for a while before it moved. Not with haste but with reverence. The historian did not try to record every detail because they now understood that the dream was not meant to be trapped in ink or memory. It was alive in its own way, fluid, breathing, impossible to own. But they could mark its passing, acknowledge the shape it left behind like footprints after the tide. They wrote slowly, a line here, a pause, a word that felt truer than it should. The symbols on the page were not meant to inform, only to remind. The historian had begun to write less like a chronicler and more like someone whispering into the dark, trusting the dark to remember. Their words were not meant to be read. They were meant to be felt by whoever might find them, perhaps years from now, perhaps never, perhaps only by themselves in some future winter when the rhythm once again called. The day went on as days do. Soft and unnoticed at first, then gradually full of color and motion. The world resumed its song, but the historian moved through it with a kind of quiet separation. Not apart from it, just not entirely of it. Each interaction felt slightly translucent, as if they could see behind it all the dreams people were not yet telling each other. The market hummed with small talk and transactions, but beneath it was the fatigue of sleepless children, the distant memory of lullabies long forgotten by their singers, the echo of ancient hearths where elders had told stories before the fire went out. They saw it everywhere now, the subtle ache for a rhythm that had been broken. The rush, the alarms, the glare of blue light in bedrooms, the pressure to sleep in blocks like machines charging. But in some faces, some gestures, the historian glimpsed an old knowing. The woman who sat outside her door in the night hours, just watching the moon. The man who woke before dawn not for work, but simply to sit in silence with tea. The child who napped without shame under a tree, unbothered by the world's schedule. These people did not call it polyphasic sleep. They called it nothing at all. They simply were. And the historian realized, the dream hadn't gone. It had simply changed its shape. It lived in those who had not forgotten how to pause. It waited in the spaces left between thoughts, in the breath before we speak, in the stillness at the center of every truly restful night. It was not gone. It was always there. We had just stopped visiting. That night, as twilight deepened once again and the shadows grew long across the wooden floor, the historian moved through the ritual without thinking. The blanket folded, the candle lit, the notebook resting like an old friend beside the bed. No expectation, no grasping for revelation, only the welcome, only the return. And as they lay back, eyes slowly closing, the rhythm already hummed beneath their skin like a familiar song. The first sleep would come gently, and when it faded into waking, they would rise again within the dark, not to work, not to worry, but to listen, to walk, to remember. And the tree would be there. The night passed in slow, measured breaths. Outside, the world turned quietly beneath its blanket of stars, and inside, the historian slipped once more between the folds of waking and sleep, but this time with no hesitation, no question, no fear of what lay on the other side. The rhythm had become a part of them now, no longer a subject of study, but a companion. Not something to record, but something to live. In the space between dreams, they stood beneath the tree one last time. It swayed gently, though there was no wind, and from its branches hung not fruit or flowers, but small moments, flickering like fireflies, memories of people long gone, quiet prayers whispered in half-sleep, stories told under fading candlelight, eyes closing not from exhaustion but from peace. The historian watched, not with awe anymore, but with understanding. They stepped forward and touched the bark, not to ask, not to seek, but simply to say thank you. In return, the tree did not speak. It had never needed to. But the historian felt its warmth move through them, a deep and ancient echo of every soul who had ever wandered through this place, seeking rest, seeking memory, seeking a piece of themselves they didn't know they'd lost. When the historian awoke again in the early hush of morning, they did not reach for the pen. They did not light the candle. They simply sat, hands resting quietly in their lap, and watched as the light crept into the corners of the room like a soft tide returning home. There was nothing more to find, nothing more to chase. The dream had done its work. The rhythm would continue, and they were no longer sleepless.